This is chapter 1, the introductory chapter to the textbook is called Energy, Past, Present, and the Future. Well, in this chapter we will discuss some of the historical background of what the energy had been used throughout the human period, and we look at the reserves, supplies, and demands as it changes, and what are the ramifications of the energy as far as the political ramification, economical, environmental, and social ramification. Energy is one of those topics that you cannot discuss the science without looking at different aspects of it and how it will affect the human civilizations. The primary sources of energy, traditionally it has been just the wood, even the dung animals, and gradually as we used up the wood, we switched to the coal. And then as we were running out of coal, and we found new sources of energy, which included oil, natural gas, and we moved to the fossil fuel era. As we are using them up and the environmental consequences of using fossil fuel, they add up, we try to move to more renewable forms of energy, which include hydro, wind, solar, biomass, etc. In addition to the fossil fuels, we have been using nuclear energy in the past centuries, and now all of these are viable sources of the energy for us. As this diagram shows, up to the year 1860, the area of industrial revolution, then we used very little energy, and most of the energy was in the form of wood, and toward the end of it we switched to coal when the steam engine became more prominent and producing power and other forms of machines. In around 1900s, we found petroleum. Petroleum was more convenient form of fuel because it was liquid and could be transported easier. That gave rise, to the whole industry of transportation and automobiles, and the oil industry picked up. Natural gas has always been available with the oil, except natural gas is in the form of gas and it is very difficult to store them. Therefore, natural gas did not get the prominent use as we know it today. Until the mid-1950s, that nuclear energy just started to be used, and natural gas and oil use had been continued exponentially. As we move on to the 21st century, we are still very much dependent on the fossil fuels, and this trend is going to continue for the foreseeable future. These two slides will show us the consumption of the energy. The slide at the left will give you the world energy consumption in forms of different form of fuels. As this diagram shows, fossil fuel is a dominant form of the energy that we've been using and has been increasing since 1950s in a very, very rapid rate. And those include oil, coal, and natural gas. Hydroelectricity had been picked up somewhat, and the nuclear has also increased somewhat. Renewable energy so far has not been a big part of our energy mix, but they are expected to play a bigger role in the future. The slide at the right is the world energy consumption in different parts of the world. Again, we can see that the US, Europe, and Japan, the industrial countries, have been using the fossil fuel, for the most part, and have been continue to use it. Kind of flattens out as we move on to 21st century. What is interesting to note is that what is considered to be the rest of the world, which includes the developing world, have been using energy in a much, much faster rate. So the future As developing countries becoming developed, they require more and more energy. These are the countries that they have higher population rate too, so they would be the dominant, consumers of energy in the future. Middle Eastern countries also, they have most of the liquid fuel comes from the Middle East. About 60% of them have been very slow in using of the fossil fuels and have been only using about 7% of their own energy in the form of fossil fuel. This is the consumption of United States versus the world. As this diagram shows, the fossil fuel is roughly 80% of all the energy used. It is consistent. The US and the world is both about 80%, and nuclear is about 8 to 10%. And again, hydro and biomass geothermal are relatively very small, and the wind and solar is has really just started to pick up, somewhat in the United States, and the world as a whole has been lagging behind. This is the consumption by different countries. As is interesting to note is that the United States is by far the biggest consumers of energy. And in the 1990s, these are given in the tons of oil equivalent. It doesn't mean these are the amount of the oil that they have used. It means that if the amount of energy was being, supplied by the oil, how much oil we would have used. We can see that since 1990s, the fossil fuel has increased in the decade to 2000, and then by the 2010, the consumption has dropped a bit, mainly because of the stagnation in the United States economy, but also because some of the manufacturing has been shifted to other developing countries such as China and India. What is interesting also to note is that the biggest, fastest rise in the rate of consumption has been in China. China for the past decade has been increasing consumption at the rate of 10% a year continuously. Very close to China is India, which has been more than 7%, and the Middle East has also picked up consumption. Part of that is because of maybe the sanctions which was imposed on Iran, and they have been using a lot of their own resources, to develop domestic industries, and also the other Middle Eastern countries that they have been trying to capitalize on the oil that they have to build their economy. United States is pretty much have been flat, has used only less than about 1% increase as a whole, and we expect the trend is going to continue like that. Same goes for much of the Europe, and in the case of Russia, because of the turmoil and the dissolution of the former Soviet Republic, the actual rate of increase has been negative. Overall, the world energy consumption is expected to increase about 2%, and that would increase to about 2.5% by the end of this decade. This slide gives you the amount of the reserves. Reserves are what we have. These are proven reserves. That means the amount that with a very high degree of certainty, usually 90%, we would expect we would have this much of the resources in the ground. These are the parts that we have not excavating them yet, but they're expected to be available when we need them. Again, United States is number one as far as the total amount of reserves. We can see US has about 30% of the coal and about 2%, but 2% of the oil. These are conventional resources, and 4% of natural gas. So we are very rich in the coal. As far as the conventional fuels, which is petroleum and gas, were declining very, very fast. As we will talk later, there are new non-conventional sources of fuel such as tar sands, shale oil, and shale gas that will supplement some of these losses in the traditional conventional fossil fuel. Russia, on the other hand, is very high on oil and natural gas. So basically natural gas is about a quarter of, or 24% of the entire natural gas in the world resides in Russia. Oil is relatively, high. It's about 6%, and also it has some coal, but not as much as the United States. China is pretty much has only coal. There's no oil or no natural gas reserve there. Therefore, we should watch China as far as their dependence on the foreign oil and natural gas. That could be the source of much of the conflict in the coming year as China's economy grows and they would require more and more energy, access to the economy, the world energy. Same goes with India. India is pretty much is poor in all front, in the energy, and so far they have not been using energy. Still, they use it animal dung and some wood and trashes, but they will be a big consumer of the energy in the future.